Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Dear students, Assalamu alaikum. I hope you are doing well. So today we will study this short poem Prospice by Robert Browning. So as far as the title is concerned, Prospice it's in Latin and it means to look forward. Okay? So this is a poem of hope and courage, or you will find life optimism philosophy in this poem. And what is the life optimism philosophy of Browning? It's a philosophy which is based on optimism. Optimism means hope, hopefulness, courage, determination. All right, so let's get started. Robert Browning. The timeline is given 1812 to 1889. Okay, he was a son of clerk and had no formal education. So Browning's father was a clerk and Browning had no formal education. He was a contemporary of Tennyson. You have already studied that poem, Elegy, Break, Break, Break by Tennyson. So Tennyson and Browning, they belong to the same age, Victorian period. So there are different ages in the history of English literature: Middle Ages, the Renaissance, Romantic period, Victorian period, Modern period. So Browning and Tennyson, they belong to Victorian period. So that's why we are saying that they were contemporaries. Contemporaries means they belong to the same age. Okay. Same age. Age doesn't mean that they were equal in age. They were 29 years old or 30 years old. Age means they belong to the same period in the history of English literature. That was Victorian period. Okay. Next, he perfected the use of the dramatic monologue. So you should know this about Robert Browning, that he is famous for his use of this technique of dramatic monologue. And when I was teaching you kinds of poetry in my first lecture, I still remember, I explained dramatic monologue, that what is it? And at that time, I had given you the example of Robert Browning and his poem, which is dramatic monologue, My Last Duchess. Okay, so you should keep this in your mind, that Robert Browning is famous for his technique of dramatic monologue. Next, he was a thinker of his time, life optimism philosophy. So you should remember this as well, that Browning's life optimism philosophy is very famous. And what is that philosophy? That he was the one who was always hopeful, courageous. Okay, so if I compare Browning with Tennyson, you have already studied Tennyson. So if we do compare and contrast, you will find that Tennyson was a gloomy soul, always in grief. But Browning was a very hopeful person who, despite all the miseries, sufferings, and difficulties, he was still hopeful. So this is the difference between Tennyson and Browning. Tennyson was a gloomy soul, hopeless, and Browning, a happy soul, hopeful. All right? So that's why Browning's life optimism philosophy is very famous. So, in short, what is that life optimism philosophy? It's hope, it's courage, it's determination. Next. Okay, now what is dramatic monologue and what is soliloquy? Soliloquy is a new word for you, but let me explain the difference between dramatic monologue, and soliloquy. First, you should know there is a monologue. Mono means one and log means speech. Okay, so monologue means when the single or one person is speaking. That's it. That is monologue. What is dramatic monologue? Now, dramatic monologue is a long speech by one person during a conversation, and the listener is passive. So what was monologue? Simply monologue, speech by single person, one person. That's it. But dramatic monologue, it's a speech by single person, but there is always a passive listener. Listener is there who doesn't respond or reply, but he is there. Okay, and then we have soliloquy. What is soliloquy? The act of speaking one's thoughts aloud, when by oneself or regardless of any hearers. No listener at all. When you talk to your own self, self-talk you can say, that is soliloquy. So you should know the difference, that what is dramatic monologue? Dramatic monologue is a speech by single person, but there is always a passive listener. though that listener doesn't reply, doesn't answer, doesn't respond, but he is there, present. And what is soliloquy? In soliloquy, it's a kind of conversation with one's own self, self talking, speaking one's thoughts aloud, just like in dramas. If you watch dramas, so it happens that the character is talking to his own self or her own self. That is soliloquy. There is no listener, but self talk. That is soliloquy. And this poem, Prospice, when you will study it, you will find that it's not dramatic monologue. It's a kind of monologue which is more like a soliloquy. Browning is talking to his own self, regardless of any listener. There is no listener. But Browning, he is conversing with his own self, self-talk. So this poem, Prospice, you should know, this is not elegy, this is not dramatic monologue, this is a kind of monologue only. What is monologue only? Speech by single person. And it's more like soliloquy. Monologue is more like soliloquy. But dramatic monologue, there is a passive listener. So I'm repeating my words. Monologue and soliloquy. Monologue is one person is speaking. So monologue is more like soliloquy, because in soliloquy, the person talks to his own self. There is no listener. But what is dramatic monologue? Dramatic monologue is totally different. In dramatic monologue, there is always this listener who is passive. Okay, so the basic difference lies in the presence of a listener or absence of listener. If listener is present, that is dramatic monologue. If listener is not present, that is soliloquy. I hope it's clear now. Okay, let's proceed. Now this poem, Prospice. I have already told you it's in Latin, Prospice, and it means to look forward. You see, looking forward to something. Of course, a kind of hope, optimism. Okay, it is a short, simple, but philosophical poem. I have already told you, philosophical poem, life optimism philosophy is there. Hopefulness in life. It is for Browning's dead wife, Elizabeth Barrett. Okay, you should remember that though Browning has written this poem for his dead wife, but this is not an elegy. This is a monologue, which is more like soliloquy. So you should note down this point with you, rather all of these points, but highlight this point that this poem, Prospice, is for Browning's dead wife, but it is not elegy. It is a monologue which is more like soliloquy. And what is that? Browning is talking to his own self, self-talk. Okay? He is speaking his thoughts aloud. It is a poem of hope and courage. And in this poem, you will find Browning's undying belief in the immortality of the soul. So according to Browning, death is a harsh reality of life, but soul is immortal. Body dies, body is no more. But what is the point of optimism or hope for Browning? That soul will be there. Soul is immortal, and after death, man will find eternal peace. So this is what the hope of Browning is. That body dies, body is no more, but soul is there, because soul is immortal. And it's okay. If a person dies, it's okay. Why? Because after death, man will receive eternal peace, tranquility, serenity. You see, this is highly optimistic approach. That if a person is not fearful of the death, and what is the reason? That after death, there is eternal peace. There is perpetual peace and tranquility. And he is hopeful that after death, he will meet his dead wife, he will meet God, so he should not be afraid of death. Okay, so why Browning is hopeful? Because he thinks that man receives peace after death. And if death comes, so it's good for Browning. Why? Because Browning will meet his dead wife after death, and Browning will meet God after death. So this is the hope of Robert Browning. All right. Next. Okay, now here on this slide on the board, I have written a few important points regarding Tennyson and Browning, because they are the two faces of Victorian period. Victorian period, it was a time, as I have already told you, that there are these different ages in the history of English literature. So one of them is Victorian period or Victorian age. So the two important and famous faces of Victorian period were Browning and Tennyson. So, compare and contrast. Somehow, I have already told you that Tennyson was a gloomy soul, hopelessness. You have studied his poem Break, 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 which he has written on the death of his dear friend. So, he was hopeless. There was no charm for him in this world. But on the other hand, we have Browning. Browning is a happy soul, hopeful soul rather. Even death is near, but he is still hopeful. Why? Because he thinks that he will gain peace after death. Alright, now after discussing all those different points, we are back to our poem Prospice by Robert Browning. So, before reading it out for you, let me tell you something, that as far as this poem is concerned, there is this analogy of a climber. Okay, it has been used. Why? Because as far as the poet is concerned, Robert Browning, he is on the deathbed. This is the situation in this poem. What is that situation? That the poet is on the deathbed and in the process of dying. So, metaphorically, he has been shown as a climber, as a fighter, a climber who has to reach the top of the mountain, who has to reach that summit, that peak. And in this whole journey, of course, there are difficulties and miseries. So, in the same way, Browning is a kind of climber, fighter, who is on the way to death. And death is the last barrier. When he will cross that barrier of death, he will reach his destination. And what is his destination? To meet his dead wife after death and to meet God after death. So, just like a climber, he has to reach the top of the mountain, and during this whole journey, he faces many difficulties and sufferings. So, in the same way, Browning is also a climber or a fighter who has to cross this barrier or this difficulty of death. Why? Because just like climber will reach to the top of the mountain, Browning will reach to the eternal peace after that barrier and difficulty. So, this is the analogy which is used. Analogy, okay? Okay, so let me read it out for you. This poem tells us about ordeal of death, ordeal, test, which is described to be like the ordeal of a man who struggles to the top of a high mountain in storm and darkness with fear that he may lose his courage before reaching the top. Just like I told you right now, that this analogy of climber, that just like a climber and a fighter, he has to reach the top of the mountain, and in darkness, or you can say in storm, so he is somehow fearful that what if he loses his courage. So the poet says that we must bear all the sufferings of death, because death, after that, there is eternal peace for us. So, two points. Number one, this analogy of a climber has been used. Metaphorically, the poet has been shown as a climber, and he has to cross that barrier, that difficulty. And what is that last barrier? Death. And after this, he will meet his dead wife and he will meet God. So he is hopeful. And number two, another point is, he says that man should face all the sufferings and miseries of death. Why? Because after that, there is peace for him. So, in order to gain that perpetual, eternal, and immortal peace, man should be brave. Now, on this slide, words and meanings I have written on the board for you. Number one. Okay. You should know that as far as this prospice is concerned, it's a Latin term, I have told you, which means to look forward. And as far as the other words and meanings are concerned, number one, foe, it means enemy. The arch fear, the greatest of all fears. So A has been capitalized, F has been capitalized. And what is the reason behind it? Because Browning wanted to give a visible form to this fear. He has concretized it, something which can be seen. You see, usually we cannot see fear, but in order to give visible form to that fear, to give intensity, he has capitalized A and F. Okay, so the greatest of all fears. Guerdon. Guerdon means reward. Next, brunt. Brunt, main force of an ordeal. Ordeal is a kind of test. Okay. Fiend. Fiend voices. Fiend voices means voices of the fiends of hell. Devil, voice of devil. Evilness. Or you can say demon. Demon or devil. Evilness. Fiend. Okay. Okay, girls. Now I will proceed and I will explain these lines for you. So kindly open your books. It's page number 30. Prospice by Robert Browning. A metaphorical and philosophical poem. Okay, now let me read it out for you. Fear death, to feel the fog in my throat, the mist in my face. When the snows begin and the blasts denote, I'm nearing the place. I'm nearing the place, the power of the night, the press of the storm, the post of the foe, where he stands, the arch fear in a visible form. Now he says, fear death? This is a kind of rhetorical question. Rhetorical question is when the purpose is not to seek an answer, but for emphasis or to highlight the point, rhetorical question is asked. So he says, fear death? One should be fearful or afraid of death to feel the fog in my throat, or one should feel suffocation. You see, where one feels that he cannot breathe properly. Should he feel this? The mist in my face. You see, the vision is blur for him now. He, as I have already discussed, that what was the situation or what is the situation in this poem? The situation given is that the poet is on the deathbed and he is in the process of dying. So his condition is compared to the condition or state of a climber who has to reach the top of the mountain. So just like that journey in which that climber faces different difficulties, he has to challenge or he has to face storm, blasts. So just like that, the man who is on the deathbed and who is about to die, he has or he faces the same difficulties. You see, so this is the analogy in this point which I have discussed with you. So fear death, one should be fearful of death to feel the fog in my throat. You see, to feel the fog in my throat means to feel suffocated, where one feels that he cannot breathe properly. So should he feel like that? The mist in my face, it means that the vision, the scenario, it's now blur and unclear for him. When the snows begin and the blasts denote, just like a climber who wants to reach the top of the mountain, he faces different difficulties during that journey. Sometimes he travels in the storm, sometimes he travels in the snow. So just like that, he is feeling, the poet is feeling that he is facing difficulties and death is that last barrier and he has to cross that barrier to reach his ultimate destination. I'm nearing the place. So just like a climber, he gives satisfaction to his own self that okay, I'm near my destination. I have to move on. So just like that, the poet Robert Browning, he is also giving satisfaction to his own self that okay, fine, death is the last barrier. You just have to fight with it. So he gives courage to himself, hope to himself. The power of the night, the press of the storm. You see, so just like a climber faces that intensity, that pressure of the storm, snowflakes, snowstorm. So the post of the foe. The post of the foe means the position of the enemy. And what is that enemy? Of course, it's death. So, where death stands, the arch fear in a visible form. Now, this is the greatest of all fears. Arch fear, the greatest of all fears in a visible form. And death somehow, you see, it's there in front of you. And when somebody knows that he is going to die, just like the poet on the deathbed, he knows that he is about to die. He is going to die. So somehow he could see the death in front of him, just like you can say in concretized form, invisible form, that okay, this is my enemy waiting for me. You see, so this is metaphorical poem, and these lines are very metaphorical. Okay, so he has concretized, or you can say the poet has concretized, or he has given this visible form to death, just like death is the greatest of all enemies, foe. ठीक है, and he is standing, he means death is standing on the way, and one has to fight with it, one has to cross that barrier of death. Just like a climber, he faces different difficulties and he crosses different barriers in order to reach his ultimate destination, that place, that point. Okay, so just like a climber, the poet Robert Browning, he also faces challenges, and he also feels this challenge to cross this barrier of death. All right. Yet the strong man must go, for the journey is done and the summit attained. Summit, height, peak. And the barriers fall, though a battle's to fight ere the guerdon be gained. E-R-E, it means before. Guerdon means reward. Though a battle's to fight ere the guerdon be gained, the reward of it all. So, yet the strong man must go. So, in spite of all these difficulties, the strong man has to move on. Strong man has to go on. For the journey is done and the summit attained. Why? Because the destination is near, and he is about to reach that peak or height of the mountain, and the barriers fall. And ultimately, when a man is strong, all the barriers fall. So, he says that in spite of all the difficulties, a strong man must go. Why? Because as far as these barriers and difficulties and hurdles and obstacles are concerned, they fall in front of a strong man. So one just needs courage and bravery. So ultimately what happens? Journey is done and the summit is attained and the peak is attained. One reaches the destination and the barriers fall. And the barriers, they are removed. Though a battle's to fight ere the guerdon be attained. So if somebody wants to gain reward, he has to fight a battle. ठीक है? So if somebody wants to gain reward, so of course that person has to go through pain. Why? Because no pain, no gain. The reward of it all. And he says that he is fighting with death, which is a barrier. And what will happen ultimately? He will be rewarded. And that will be the greatest of all rewards. So, just like that, we should learn this lesson from these lines, that ultimately, if a man is strong, he crosses all the barriers and he faces all the challenges. So, one just needs courage and bravery. Okay? Next. I was ever a fighter, so one fight more. So, he says that he was always a fighter. Man is a fighter in this world. During this whole journey of life, man fights with difficulties, tests, miseries, sufferings. So, man is a fighter. So the poet says that he was always a fighter. So one fight more, the best and the last. So this is the last fight with death. Why? Because after death he will gain eternal peace. So he says that he was always a fighter. During this whole journey of life, he has been a fighter, a warrior. And now, this fight with death, this is the last and best of all fights. Why? Because after that, he will be rewarded. He will meet his dead wife after death. He will meet God after death. He will receive peace, harmony, tranquility, and serenity. I would hate that death bandaged my eyes and forbore and bade me creep past. He says he would hate that death bandaged my eyes, bandaged, closed, and forbore, refrained, avoid, to avoid, and bade me creep past. So he says he would dislike it. He would hate it if death closes his eyes and he dies silently. Okay? So he says that he will feel bad about it. That if death closes his eyes without any difficulty, you see, without any forbore, without any refrain, or if he avoids the sufferings, and bade me creep past, and if he dies silently, underline this line, and bade me creep past, this means if he dies alone or silently. So these lines mean, number one, that he will feel bad about it if death closes his eyes and he avoids the sufferings of death. Number two, he would also dislike it if he dies silently without any suffering, and bade me creep past. And if death allows me to die silently without any suffering. This is the meaning of this line. Okay. No, let me taste the whole of it, fare like my peers. The heroes of old bear the brunt, in a minute pay glad life's arrears of pain, darkness, and cold. He says, as I have already explained, that he will feel bad about it if he dies without any suffering. He says, no, let me taste the whole of it. He wants to taste the whole of death. You see, everyone has to taste death. It means that everyone has to die. So he says he wants to have this whole taste of death, that how it feels when someone is near death or when someone is about to die. Fare like my peers. Okay, so fare like my peers, same just like my fellows, they have died. Peers, fellows. Fare like, to have the same sort of experience which his fellows had. So he says, no, let me taste the whole of it, fare like my peers, the heroes of old. He says that I want to taste all of it, all the sufferings of death, just like my fellows have experienced, and they were the real heroes. Okay? Bear the brunt, in a minute pay glad life's arrears of pain, darkness, and cold. Bear the brunt, tolerate the intensified or highest peak of that misery and test. Brunt, ordeal, test, misery. So one should tolerate that intensified peak of misery, difficulties, suffering, ordeal, and test. In a minute, pay glad life's arrears. So in 1 minute, you should pay back to your life. How? Of course, you might have seen happiness in life. This is what he says, that man, he also experiences happiness in life. So this is a kind of debt. The man is in debt. नहीं कहते कर्जदार होना. So you have to pay back. If you have seen happiness in your life, now this is the time for you to pay back. So you should suffer. So, how can one pay back? That person should suffer the debt of sufferings that we owe. And if we had a happy life, so now we are near to death, so we have to suffer. Why? Because we are in debt. DEBT, and it is pronounced as debt. Okay? So, one should tolerate this test, this misery, this suffering. Why? Because one has already seen happiness in life, and now this is the time to pay back. Now this is the time to suffer. Okay? So, this is how you can pay back. All right. Of pain, darkness, and cold. He says that he will pass, or he will across all these barriers of this pain, this darkness, this coldness. So just like him, one should know how to tolerate or how to bear these sufferings and miseries. Okay? And these sufferings, this pain, this darkness, this coldness, it will pass away. Of course, it will finish. For sudden, the worst turns the best to the brave. So, the one who is brave, even the worst situation, it becomes easy. So, one needs bravery, determination, courage. Why? Because when one is brave, the things they change for him. And even the bad, evil, or worse thing, it becomes best for the brave person. Next, the black minutes at end. Now, this worst time, it's about to end. And the elements rage, the fiend voices that rave, shall dwindle, shall blend, shall change, shall become first a piece out of pain. So, the black minutes at end. Now, this is the time of end of the suffering of death. All the elements rage. Rage is a kind of intense anger. The fiend voices that rave. Fiend voices, voices of devil or demon. All right? That rave. Rave, a kind of loud roar. You see? Deep voice. Loud and deep sound voice. So the elements rage, the fiend voices that rave. Those voices of evil, devil, and demon from hell shall dwindle, shall blend, shall become less. They should become less loud and they should become more harmonious. Why? Because one should not be fearful of death. Shall change, shall become first a piece out of pain. So even that voice, those voices from hell, they will become less loud and they will become more peaceful, more harmonious for those who are brave, who are courageous, those who have this courage and determination to face the difficulties. So, if a person is brave, if he has courage, if he has determination, he can do anything. Rather, for a person like that who is brave, who has courage, who has determination, even the voices of hell, even that hell, it becomes peaceful for him. So, one should know how to face challenges. The black minutes at end. So, this is the end of the suffering of death. And the elements rage, the fiend voices that rave, shall dwindle, shall blend, shall change, shall become first a piece out of pain. So, all those voices, sounds, and roars of evilness, devil, demon from hell, they will become less loud, they will become more harmonious, and they will become peaceful after all this pain. Then a light, then thy breast. Now, here he is addressing his dead wife. Robert Browning addresses his wife. You should note it down with you. He addresses his wife. Then alight, then thy breast. O thou soul of my soul, I shall clasp thee again. Clasp thee, I will catch you again. And with God be the rest. Now, in last three lines, third last line, then alight, then thy breast. He addresses his wife that after death there will be a light of hope for him and he will be near to his wife. O thou soul of my soul. He says, he calls his wife as his soul. He says, you are soul of my soul. I shall clasp thee again. I will hold you again. So what he says, he addresses his dead wife and he says that she is soul of his soul. You are soul of my soul. And I shall clasp thee again. I will hold you again. I will catch you again. So he will hold his wife again after death. So that's why he is hopeful. He is not fearful and afraid of death. And with God be the rest. Now, what is the meaning of this line? He says that then God will decide what happens afterwards. So, who will decide what happens after death or in the life hereafter? God. So, and with God be the rest. And God will decide what happens afterwards. So, this was the poem Prospice by Robert Browning, and poem of hope, optimistic approach, life optimism philosophy. So, if I compare and contrast between Tennyson and Browning, so you studied Break, 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 which was an elegy written by Tennyson on the death of his close friend. Now, this is the poem which Browning wrote for his dead wife, you can say somehow. So, could you find any difference in that reaction? I mean, what was Tennyson's reaction on the death and what is Browning's reaction on the death? It's very different. Tennyson was a gloomy soul, confused, skeptic, hopeless. And look at the attitude of Robert Browning. He is hopeful. His attitude towards death is very different from that of Tennyson. Okay? So, I hope you understand this poem and I will share question answers in the WhatsApp group. Thank you so much. Allah Hafiz.